Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you. It's an honor and extraordinary privilege to be here before you, and particularly to be on a panel with two very beloved individuals to me, mentors, people who have endured and have been very patient with my development over the last 2 decades and have seen me in various forms. So Dr. Matson and Dr. Jackson, I love you both. I'm in awe of all the things you've accomplished, and I'm very honored to be with you in a conversation today. I would like to open, particularly on this very important conversation, which could go many directions, but I think one immediate issue that came to mind for me was, in some ways, instantiated 1400 years ago in one of the many rich moments of the interaction with our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the messiness of his many and beauty of his very real human interactions. And forever will we remember this particular moment because it was enshrined in the Quran through the Asbab wa Nuzul, the reason for revelation, around a surah known as Abasa wa Tawalla. Most of you know this story, where the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is attempting to talk to the powerful of Meccan society at a time when it was absolutely critical for the early Muslim community to establish itself, to begin to speak to the oppression they were facing as a ummah. He was in the midst of the conversation, as most commentaries tell us, with the likes of Abu Jahl, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, and others, when a man, Abdullah ibn Maktoum, blind man, came to the Prophet asking questions, sincerely inquiring about matters of faith and critical issues to spiritual development. And as we all know, and as again enshrined in the Quran, Abasa wa Tawalla, he frowned and turned away. Now, I am certainly not a religious scholar, and nor will I attempt to give us the rich commentary that exists among our scholars, but simply from a social and sociological and organizing perspective, one of many meanings that I continue to turn back to these types of examples is the way the Prophet, even Allah, gave us in the example of the best of the examples, the messiness of sometimes navigating power and privilege in a society while you're attempting to do great things. And even in that moment, he would go on, as you know, to refer to Abdullah ibn Maktoum as the man that Allah sent me 16 verses on to reprimand me. And even in reprimanding the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the most gentle way possible, reminds us all that it is not easy to speak to the issues of our day and always come out on the right side. And so one of the examples for me for why this is so relevant to many of the conversations that are taking place in today's society, one of the most challenging issues of our time is the fact that we are in polarizing times, perhaps the most polarizing times in this country, that remind us in many ways of what was happening 50 years ago in this country, when President Johnson commissioned a group of people under the Kerner Commission to study, quote unquote, the sources of unrest in the wake of Watts in '65, in the wakes of riots in '67, and in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And as famously reported in that Kerner Commission report in 1968, almost 50 years ago, the conclusion that said that in fact, we are moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. That issue today, in my mind, continues to be a perplexing and challenging and in some cases devastating issue, not only for our community but the larger society. And we need to take stock of the fact that there is, in my mind, absolutely unambiguous evidence that we as a community need to begin to speak to the fact that we are now confronting profound disparities that are underlying the unrest that we see in the streets of Baltimore, Milwaukee, that we see often in the streets of Chicago and across the country, 10,000 deep oftentimes, that are now helping to bring our country's consciousness and stir our country's consciousness again around the profound inequities that continue to perpetuate themselves and create profound trauma, pain, and suffering. What does that have to do with the Muslim community? I would contend everything. And I want to be very practical in my comments with you today. I want to suggest that we are impacted in three profound ways. And let me suggest how. One, that we are more broadly affected by this inequity when it comes to incarceration, when it comes to education, housing, all indices. And we're seeing again people, whether they're athletes, entertainers, performers, and even politicians, bringing our attention to this profound levels of inequity. We are affected in three profound ways. One, a great segment of our community is directly and broadly affected, i.e., they are the ones that are being incarcerated. They are the ones who are going back to prison on technical parole violations. They are the ones that are living on blocks. Well, our community, it's not us versus them, it is our Muslim community, not just African American, Latino, white, poor Muslims that are living in urban communities across this country, that are living in areas across this country that are being directly affected. We must see this as a Muslim issue. That there are Muslims that are being harassed and targeted by police and surveillance efforts. We must understand that this is also a direct Muslim issue. There are Muslims that are suffering in completely segregated neighborhoods and failing schools. This is, again, a Muslim issue. We also, secondarily, we must understand we are also affected by this because we are either directly or broadly implicated in the systems that perpetuate mass inequality. And this is not to be a flippant indictment on any one of us. This is just the stark realization being real about the messiness of all our lives that we inhabit. We live in communities, gated or otherwise. We send our children to very privileged schools. Many of us have the opportunities to do that. We operate hedge funds. We are investing our money in hedge funds. Many of our communities exist in extraordinary privilege, and I speak as a profoundly privileged human being. And so we must understand that we are also part of the problem and must be part of the solution, because we cannot simply say we are detached from those issues. And I think our community is increasingly becoming aware of the fact that we live in America, we live in these societies, and we are part of these societies, and we cannot pretend like the protests in our urban centers or downtown are somehow disconnected from our realities. They are very directly connected to the choices that we make, what jobs we take, where we live, and where we invest our resources, where we send our children to school, how and who we engage with. These are all difficult decisions, not easy ones, and I don't suggest there's one easy solution, but these are things that contribute to the inequities that have been persistent 50 years post-Kerner Commission report in America. And lastly, to borrow from, again, a mentor, a scholar, and a person that we'll hear from shortly, Dr. Jackson, who suggested that one of the most profound threats in our society today, when we look up against the issues, for me, and I think what Dr. Jackson says so profoundly, is the incapacitating effect on our spirituality when it comes to being irrelevant or relevant to the issues of our day. And so our community, in other words, our Muslim children, your children in college and schools, cannot simply see what's happening on the news, in the media, with a San Francisco quarterback, and then pretend like that has nothing to do with our religious identity. They want to know what Islam has to say or do, or what is, more importantly, not what it has to say, but what are the Muslims doing vis-a-vis the types of issues that are percolating and causing extraordinary pain and unrest on our streets. I want to suggest, and in closing, provide some practical thoughts and steps. I've been also profoundly privileged to be working here in Chicago with an organization and an alliance of groups that have had the support of thousands of people across the country to allow us to focus our efforts on some of these types of issues. And so what that has given me in some ways is, again, the privilege of a first-hand seat of Muslims who are attempting from all walks of life to make a difference. I want to suggest 3 steps and give you an illustration of how that looks like and could look like even in the face of what's happening here in Chicago and places like Chicago across America. 3 steps that mirror a notion of mind, body, and soul. It is not enough for us to simply critique and analyze, but we must better understand the issues of our day. And so I want to suggest that one of the first steps you take as a family, or one steps that you can take as an individual, is take one of the many issues, whether it is housing, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it is food security, whether it's the issues that are among the many issues that are perpetuating profound levels of inequity and disparity in America, and better understand that issue. Devote some time to researching and speaking to those who are directly affected by those issues. Do one-to-ones with those people's lives who have been devastated by some of those issues. Don't simply rely on the 30-second soundbite, but talk to real people who are directly impacted, and study and read. And that's the mind. The second, the body. Find a way to get involved. Invest with your resources, your time, your energy. And what I'm talking about is a sustained investment. An investment that is not simply one summer or one semester of college, but a commitment to an issue that allows you to have some level of impact on one variable that can make a big difference. And in some cases that could come both with resources and time. And I've seen that in profound ways on a number of occasions. And lastly, I would say the soul. Spiritually invest in that issue. Spiritually pray for the success and connection of brothers and sisters who are directly impacted. Spiritually pray that we as a community can be a force for good, that we can be a relevant transformational force for good. I'll give you in closing an illustration of how that came together very practically on one of many issues here in Chicago and the state of Illinois, the city and state that you're in today. We, like many states across the country, were directly affected by mass incarceration. That is in many ways one of the underlying reasons for the fact that we have, I believe, and I think many others who look at the data believe, we have in August the highest homicide rate that we've had in this city in 20 years. Because we continue to put into prison and allow people out of prison who have no other means to survive other than the underground economy, and that's why we have a recidivism rate of over 50%. And in this state alone, just a couple of years ago, that 50% was excess of 11,000 people, because 20,000 come home every year. Of that 11,000, over close to 80%, over 8,000, returned to prison on technical parole violations. Those violations included everything as unjust as literally violating 2 brothers or sisters coming home who are technically on parole and in proximity to one another. And for those of you who understand that, the injustice of that issue, you understand that they are returning to communities that now, because of policies, are filled with people who are on parole. And any police officer or parole agent can arbitrarily have pulled over and found a young man talking to an older brother who's trying to mentor them and technically say, "Aren't you on paper? isn't he on paper? Get right back in the car. And they will go directly back to prison and find themselves languishing in prison, waiting for a trial for another 3 or 4 months, losing all possibility of job prospects, housing security, and inevitably creating the cycle of incarceration. That's just one of many issues. At Iman, the organization that I again work with, we reached out, and because we work with a base, there's a lawyer, her name's Mari Musafir, very extraordinarily successful, who's on our board, and mashallah, privileged like us to be in situations where her family, although a daughter of immigrants, is not directly affected by the criminal justice system, she personally has been very invested. Worked with a brother among our leaders who was in prison for 24 years, who studied law for 20 years in prison, who was also seeing the direct effects of this issue. They helped to draft a piece of legislation to modify and reform parole conditions in the state of Illinois. Together, for the last couple of years, we've been building awareness, building an alliance with churches, neighborhood block clubs, Latino groups, and build up an arsenal, an army of over 150 leaders that would go down to our state capitol over a dozen times on this issue. And this year, in the spring, we not only drafted that piece of legislation, it passed the state house, and it passed the state senate, and then was passed by and signed into law by the governor of this state just 2 weeks ago. And while we know this is just simply scratching the surface, this is one of many very important steps that are creating reform, that are creating change, that are creating hope. And so I close us with this, that our Prophet ﷺ directed us to be a community that also had the capacity to see good, to see hope, to see light in the darkest of spaces. And as we are confronted with the numerous challenges of navigating power and privilege and navigating our identity in the face of extraordinary hardship, I implore each and every one of you to continue to find active ways to be part of that legacy of mercy and justice that is at the root of our tradition. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.